Today we are continuing with A Hope More Powerful Than the Sea. We're on chapter 7 and it's called Deal with the Devil. So I think things are going to start to pick up here. I'm very interested to see what is going to happen. On a balmy June afternoon in 2014, 9 months after Doa and Bassam's engagement, the Elzamel family was finishing up lunch. Doa was still living at home with her family, since she and Bassam could only move in together when they had a formal wedding. After helping to clear up the plates, Bassam suggested that they all go for a walk before he and Shakri returned to work for the barbershop. The young couple walked ahead of the rest of the family, holding hands and chatting. When they reached the Kornichi, Bassam turned to Doa. His voice was lower than usual. He spoke deliberately, as if he had rehearsed what he was going to say. I have something important to discuss with you. I want us to go to Europe. We have no future here. We're stuck and we can't go back to Syria. He looked down at her, into her astonished face, and began speaking more quickly. Everyone is going. A friend of mine went to Germany and applied to bring his family there. It's much better there, Doa. You could go to school and I could open a barbershop. We could have a home together and start a family. He watched her face hopefully, searching for some sign of agreement. What do you think? We just need to get the money to go. All Doa could think was the vast sea that stood between Egypt and Europe, and of water closing in over her head and filling her lungs. She still hadn't learned to swim, and just the thought of crossing that expanse of water made her panic. She knew that refugees had no legal way to get to Europe. They wouldn't be able to get the documents they needed to sail on another big ferry, like the one that they had taken to Egypt. If they applied for a visa, it would be rejected. And to ask for asylum in Europe, you had to arrive there physically. And Doa knew the only way to get there was considered illegal by Egyptian authorities and unsafe by everyone. Do you mean by a smuggler's boat? She asked. Don't even think about it. I won't do it. She knew those boats were small, decrepit, and overcrowded, and heard of stories of boats sinking and refugees drowning. She couldn't believe that Bassam would want to risk it. How could she go across the sea in one of those when she couldn't even set a foot in water? But, Bassam stammered, you will only have to be in the water up to your knees, and then you'll be safe on a boat. We'll be rescued once we get to Italy. Then we can make our own way to Sweden. Bassam explained how distress signals are sent out as soon as a refugee boat reaches Italian waters, and that the Italian Coast Guard sends ships out to bring everyone safely ashore. Absolutely not, Doa shivered. My answer is no, Bassam. But he continued to bring up the subject every chance he got, trying to find a way to convince her. Doa couldn't understand why he kept insisting when he knew how scared she was of water. Every time they went to the beach together with her family, he saw her keep far from the shore, watching everyone else splash around in the waves. Bassam was a good swimmer, for a reason. He told Doa that back in Daraa, when he was only 13, he visited a lake with 2 of his friends. None of them knew how to swim, but they waded in anyway, playfully splashing one another. Then one of his friends moved into deeper water and began gasping for air and flailing his arms. Bassam and his other friend thought their friend was joking, but when they finally reached him, his face was submerged and his body was still. He had drowned. After that day, Bassam had vowed that he would teach himself to swim. I promised myself that I would never stand by helplessly again while someone else I care about drowns, he told Doa. He also told her another story. A few years later, he was at a lake with some friends sitting on a rocky shore. By that time, he was a confident swimmer. In the distance, he witnessed a rowboat capsize and a teenage girl fall into the water, obviously in distress. He ran towards the boat and jumped in the water. When he reached the girl, he wrapped her arms in his and pulled her to the shore, possibly saving her life. However, these stories did not reassure Doa. Every time she imagined being submerged in water with no shore in sight, she thought she would be sick. Bassam, I don't want gold or expensive furniture and a life abroad in Europe, she told him one night when he was trying yet again to convince her. They were alone on the balcony of Doa's apartment, watching the sky darken while the rest of the family was inside listening to the radio. She couldn't imagine a life without them nearby. I want to stay close to our family. What if we went to Saudi Arabia instead? You used to work there. In Saudi Arabia, they could start new and still be close enough to her family, and she wouldn't have to take a boat to get there. You wouldn't like it, he countered. It's too conservative. You would have to wear a burqa. You'd have to cover in black from head to toe with only a mesh slit in the material to look through. You won't even be able to go out unless you're with me. Exasperated, he said, half of my friends have gone to Europe. I get messages on Facebook from Sweden and Germany all the time. They have good jobs and they're still going to school. They say we'd be welcome there, not like here. Bassam waited for Doa to ponder this information, then added, the other messages I get all the time are from friends back in Syria telling me who has died. Have you forgotten what it's like to see people die every day? Have you forgotten all the horror stories about those boats? Doa shot back. And the stories about refugees like us drowning? Angered, she stood up quickly and went inside to be with her family, leaving Bassam alone on the balcony. She turned her back on him so that he couldn't see the tears and sadness and frustration spilling down her cheeks. This went on for 2 months. Bassam brought it up every chance he had, trying different ways to convince her. Doa, you look tired. You're not thriving here. In Europe, your health would improve. Doa's health was indeed worsening each week. Anytime Bassam saw her waver, he reminded her of Europe. In Europe, you can study. We can open a salon together and you will earn money and finally be able to afford new clothes. You can even have a nice house there. We'll be respected instead of despised, and our kids will have a nice life. He showed her pictures that he received of his friends, smiling in the front of historical monuments and blooming parks. One friend was pictured in Amsterdam, standing on the bridge over a canal with a pretty cityscape in the background. Seeing these photos, Doa couldn't help but listen and dream. Europe seemed like a place of order and hope, a fantasy land of possibility. The life in photos depicted was so different than poverty, struggle, and danger she had come to accept as normal. Egypt had nothing for her and her family other than hostility and grueling work at low wages that could never quite provide what the family needed. They barely had enough food and rent, and any time they needed anything extra, such as medicine or a pair of shoes for Hamadi, who grew out of his, they had to borrow money that they couldn't repay or sell one of their few remaining treasures. Doa had no way of finishing high school in Egypt, and she had all but given up on her dream of going to university. Like thousands of other Syrian refugees, she felt stuck in a life of limbo in a country where her own citizens were facing a sinking economy, high inflation, and rising food prices. In Egypt, Syrian refugees were tolerated, but with few possibilities to find real work and fully integrate into society. Doa began to wonder what it might be like to walk out the door without fear of being abducted, or for her siblings to go to school without fear of being harassed, beaten up, or worse. She remembered what it was like when her mother wasn't always sick and her father wasn't always exhausted, when Hamadi was a cheerful boy with a chance at a normal childhood. None of that was possible now in Egypt. And in Syria, things were only getting worse. Hundreds of people died in a chemical weapons attack in Damascus, and the Assad government was accused by the international community of carrying it out. Extremists, now under the umbrella of the rebel group, had begun fighting each other, weakening what moderate FSA oppositions there was. In particular, a rising and violent organization called the Islamic State was gaining territory and imposing its fundamentalist doctrine and severe interpretation of Sharia, Islamic law, on Syria. So because the government is losing power, because the people are losing power, these really dangerous and extremist groups which means that they believe so powerfully in one thing, are able to take advantage of the weak situation and start to take over. So this is not looking good for Syria. At least 1/3 of the population was now uprooted, with 3 million of them struggling as refugees in neighboring countries of Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and Egypt. Doa slowly began to consider the possibility of leaving. However, Bassam began wavering in his decision to move on. He loved Doa too much to force her to do something that terrified her and began to have second thoughts. He decided that he should go to Europe on his own and then, once he settled, send for Doa and her family. He had heard of programs in Europe that reunited refugees with family members who had stayed behind. All you had to do, his friend had told him, was get there and ask for asylum, then apply to bring your family into the country as well. They would then be issued visas and plane tickets. You could join me in no time, he told Doa when he relayed his revised plan to her. They were sitting side by side at a small table in their favorite cafe, sipping tea and smoking shisha pipe, while Bassam took a break from work. Doa, stunned, set down her cup. I won't let you go alone, she said without hesitation. I can't be separated from you. You're just jealous, Bassam teased her. You think if I go to Europe ahead, I'll find a beautiful European woman to replace you. Doa punched him in the shoulder. Fine, she shot back. You go find one, and I'll find an Egyptian husband. While they joked about this, deep down, Doa was hurt that Bassam would consider going to Europe without her. And maybe she was a little afraid that he might actually find a glamorous woman in Europe that he liked better than her. I'm just kidding, Dodo. I would never look at anyone else. You are the only one for me. Finding someone else would be like trying to replace the moon with the stars. Still unsettled, Doa rested her head on his shoulder. You can't ever go anywhere without me. She felt her head rise and fall with his breath, but she could tell that Bassam was set on going, with or without her. She was tired of seeing him struggle in Egypt and knew she had no good case to convince him to stay. She felt that if she refused to let him go, she would be standing in the way of his future. Yet she couldn't stand the idea of staying behind if he left. Her life was with him, one way or another, and neither of them had a life in Egypt. She began to think that perhaps she could brave the water if it meant having a shot at a decent life with a man that she loved. She told herself that she would also be helping her family, sending money to them and eventually bringing them to a better place. What she didn't know was that Bassam was already begun discussing his idea with her mother. It's up to you, Hannah told the young man she loved like a son, but I think you should break up with Doa before leaving. Never, he explained, stung by the idea of it. I am going because I want to give Doa everything she wants. He continued to plead his case, and Hannah finally gave in and told him that if he was dead set on going, it was fine with her. But she felt that he should travel ahead, find a place for a family, and then apply for Doa to join him later as a wife. I do not want her traveling with those smugglers, Hannah said. Anyway, there's no way she'll set foot in water. A few days later, Doa told her mother that she decided to go to Europe with Bassam. Hannah was devastated at the thought of Doa's making the difficult, dangerous journey, but understood that they felt that this was their only shot at a better life. But just thinking about Doa's being crammed on a boat with hundreds of other refugees horrified Hannah. However, she knew that Doa, having made her decision, would be adamant about carrying it out. Either you let me go to Europe or you can send me back to Syria, Doa told her mother the first time Hannah protested. She looked at her determined daughter, now 19 years old and an engaged woman, and knew that she couldn't stop her. That year, already over 2,000 refugees and migrants had lost their lives attempting to sail to Europe, and it was only the beginning of August. Late summer and early fall, when the seas were relatively calm and the weather was warm, was peak season for refugees to sail across the Mediterranean. More lives would inevitably be lost at sea. Worldwide wars, conflict, and persecution had forced more people to flee their homes and seek refuge and safety elsewhere than any other time since people began keeping track of their displacements. By the end of 2014, UNHCR would record close to 60 million forcibly displaced people, 8 million more than the previous year. Half of those were children. Every day that year, on average, 42,500 people became refugees, asylum seekers, or internally displaced, a fourfold increase in just 4 years. The chief reason for the massive increase in refugees was the war in Syria. With refugee populations swelling into the millions in neighboring countries and little opportunity to work or educate their children, more and more people were risking their lives on dangerous journeys to reach a better life in Europe. People fleeing directly from the relentless violence in Syria found criminal agents in their home cities who not only offered to smuggle them across the border, but, for a price, across the sea to the promised land they would supposedly find in Europe. The lucrative business of smuggling people away from the wars and poverty of Africa was quickly expanded to Libya to meet the growing demand for Syrian and Palestinians for sea route from Egypt. So people are taking advantage of the refugees needing to escape, and they're charging them money to smuggle them across the sea. The smugglers were not difficult to find through word of mouth in refugee neighborhoods or on Facebook when they advertised what looked like vacation packages on luxury lots. 2 tickets to Europe would cost Bassam and Doa $5,000 and $2,500 to be paid up front, the rest being paid if they made it safely to Italy. The smuggler Bassam found was a Syrian middleman using a fake name who was known to the community as the go-to frontman. He told Bassam that he could sell him passage on a safe ocean liner and that the journey would take no longer than a few days. As the day to leave approached, Doa began to have a sense of foreboding about the trip. One day, she and Bassam were at their favorite cafe talking about the smuggler's promises of safe passage. She shared her fears with him. She told him she'd had a premonition of that the boat would sink. "You worry too much, Dodo," Bassam admonished her. "I just have a strong feeling that we'll be fine." But he wouldn't tell her of his own dark fears. Bassam also wanted to be strong for her, and that meant keeping his concerns to himself. Bassam didn't have enough money left in his savings to pay for the trip, and the Al-Zamal family had no extra cash at all. To come up with the money, Doa sold the gold bracelets and necklace Bassam had bought for her engagement, and the laptop that he had given her as a gift. Hannah also sold some of the jewelry to pitch in, reluctant to see the pieces go, but wanting to invest in her daughter's future and willing to pay extra for a safe boat. Bassam's family in Syria also wired him $200 to help out, and all of this added up to $2,500, enough for the down payment plus $500 to start in Europe. They had no idea how they would come up with the rest, but figured that once they were there, they could borrow or work to pay it off the debt. Bassam paid the smuggler and was told to wait for the call. On August 15th, 2014, the call came. Doa packed one small black duffel bag with her most precious belongings, her Quran, a new gold-colored top and trousers that Bassam had bought her, and the remaining engagement jewelry, a silver set with a bracelet, necklace, and a ring with fake diamonds, and a Syrian metal jewelry box decorated with hearts. She had said a tearful goodbye to her father, who had to stay behind and work, holding him close and breathing in his familiar scent of shaving cream and the shisha pipe he loved. Then she stepped into a taxi with Bassam, her mother, and her siblings. Hannah insisted that she and the children accompany Doa and Bassam to see them off. Bassam gave the driver the address the smuggler had texted him of the apartment on the coastal resort town of Al-Agami, about 12 miles from Alexandria. When Doa and Bassam entered the 2-room apartment in one of the high-rises along the Al-Nakil beach, they found it filthy and hot. Flies darted from one corner to the next and above the few pieces of furniture, which were covered in dust, and appliances that were caked in heavy rust. 2 other Syrian families had arrived before them, sitting in the gloomy room on the sofa or on the floor with their restless children. Including Bassam and Doa, there were 13 of them in total. Meanwhile, Hannah and her children had settled nearby in another shabby apartment owned by the smugglers while they waited for Bassem and Doa to take off. Bassem called the smuggler to ask when they would leave. The smuggler instructed him to be patient and stay on call, that it could be any time depending on the weather and how easily they could get around the police. After several hours went by, Bassem called the smuggler back. He never told Doa much about what was said during these exchanges, but he conveyed that they would be leaving soon. They left the apartment for a brief spell to get some fresh air and to buy falafel sandwiches from the beachside stand. Doa felt self-conscious from the stares of the locals were giving her. She and Bassem and her family were obviously not there for a vacation, and everyone knew that Syrians in the area were trying to leave the country. They never received a phone call from the smuggler that day or the next. The soon days and nights started to blend together for Doa. Everyone was jumpy and anxious. Finally, Bassem's phone rang one evening in the apartment. "Get ready," the voice on the other side said. "Leave the apartment in a half an hour at 9 p.m. Go downstairs. Don't draw any attention to yourself. The bus will be waiting on the street behind the buildings." The smuggler warned Bassem to pack light, and there would be no room for luggage. Doa added a bag of dates and 2 bottles of water in her duffel bag, then carefully wrapped her passports in plastic wrap, which she then placed in a sandwich bag and zipped everything in a side pouch of the duffel bag, along with their wallet, bulging with the pocket money they received from their families. Around her, other refugees gathered their belongings. They all left the apartment with their bags, and Doa and Bassem met with Doa's family to say their goodbyes. They hugged Hannah, Saja, Noura, and Hamadi, as Doa's eyes overflowed with tears. She could barely speak through her sobs. She worried that this could be the last time she would ever see them. "Please look after yourselves. Call when you arrive. We will be worrying every minute," Hannah told them, as the situation suddenly became more real for her. "Are you sure you don't want to change your mind? Bassem, you could come and live with us. Please don't go." Hannah had been trying to be brave for Doa, but was now overcome with fear for her daughter and future son-in-law. Doa tried to reason with her mother. "Mom, nothing will change here." Doa fought to control her tears and steady her voice with determination. "It is never going to get any better. We have made up our minds," she said resolutely. Then 9-year-old Hamadi turned to Bassem and demanded with his hands on his hips, "Why don't you go by yourself and leave Doa here? I'm going to miss her." Doa smiled and hugged Hamadi again. "Don't worry. Once I get to Europe, I'll bring you there too, and we'll all be together and things will be much better." Finally, in the dark, Doa and Bassem turned and walked away from Doa's family towards a dim street corner where 2 other Syrian families were waiting. After some time, a small white bus pulled up, and a large, barbaric-looking man who was unshaven and dressed in all black stepped out and ordered them to board, joining about 30 other people on the bus, seated on top of each other to fit in. No kindness or welcome was in his voice. Doa sat on Bassem's lap and rested her arms on the duffel bag. No one on the bus spoke, but they nodded as newcomers came in solidarity. As the bus took off, Doa whispered to Bassem under her breath, "These smugglers are thugs, Bassem. I don't trust them, and they frighten me." Bassem tried to reassure her that it would be okay, even though this was not the smuggler who had told them about the journey he had promised. One of the smugglers made his own way down the aisle. He was smaller than the man who had told them to board, but he was also dressed head to toe in black and spoke harshly. Noticing Doa, he barked at her. "What do you have in your bag?" "Just some clothes and dates and water, as we were told," Doa replied timidly. He nodded. "Keep your passport with you at all times and hide it with your clothes." Then he moved on, repeated the same question and command to the next row. After what seemed like an hour, the minibus came to a halt, and they were ordered to get off. The group was immediately herded into the back of the large truck meant for transporting sand. While it was dark outside, it was pitch black in the container once the smugglers closed the back hatch, sealing them in. Everyone was crammed together with no room to move, no windows, and no air circulation. The children were strangely quiet, and Doa noticed that one woman was visibly pregnant. These thugs are inhuman, Doa whispered under her breath. I don't have a good feeling about this. Doa and Bassam could tell from the noise of honking horns, music, and voices that the truck was traveling through populated areas. But after a while, the only sound was the wheels bumping against the potholes and stones. Doa held Bassam's hand as she peered through the darkness at her fellow refugees, wondering what circumstances had driven them to embark on this dangerous journey. After an hour, the truck halted abruptly and the back hatch opened. Doa gratefully gulped the fresh air. She was stiff from sitting squeezed up against other people, and her legs shook as she jumped down from the truck, discovering that they had arrived on a barren coast. Other refugees had arrived before them, clustered in groups of families and friends, sitting on the sand and waiting silently in the dark. Including 40 other passengers from Doa and Bassam's truck, they estimated that about 200 people were gathered on the beach, now at the mercy of their 10 criminal travel agents. The smugglers were all barefoot and dressed in black, with their pant legs rolled up to their knees. They told the refugees to remain completely silent and explained that they were doing everything they could to evade the police and the Coast Guard, but by many accounts, they were also paying off officials to turn a blind eye to smuggling. Doa checked her watch. It was 11 p.m. The wait in silence was excruciating. It was cold, and she wished she had worn a sweater under her thin jacket. After 2 hours, the smugglers divided the refugees on the beach into 3 smaller groups without explanation. 100 people in the first group, and the second and third groups had about 50 each. Doa and Bassam were in the first group. As soon as it was formed, they heard the smugglers shout, "Run!" Bassam picked up their bag, and together they set off into the black night towards the sound of breaking waves. It was cloudy and thus dark and difficult to see. Doa couldn't even see her hands as they swung in front of her eyes as she took steps. After a few minutes, a voice ordered them to stop running. Keep quiet, then to start again. They could hear the sound of waves crashing and the heavy breathing of fellow travelers, but they also had no sense of orientation except for the smugglers who led them. Their eyes had adjusted to the darkness, but no boat was in sight. Instead, they were making their way to the shore. They stumbled into a group of uniformed Coast Guards asleep on the beach. At the sight of them, the entire group turned on their heels and ran in the opposite direction. Doa and Bassam were running at the head of the crowd when they heard the sound of bullets and the shout of, "You dogs, stop!" Running faster and faster, they shouted at the other refugees, warning them, "It's a trap! Run!" Bassam took Doa's hand as they sprinted. Their black bag was strapped to his back, weighing him down. Doa tried to get him to abandon it, telling him that there was nothing worth getting shot over. "No," he insisted, "all of our memories are in it." Then suddenly, he tripped and fell. The Coast Guards were gaining ground on them. Doa pulled him up and they kept running. The group that ran with them was getting smaller. The families with children and elderly surrendered, unable to outpace the guards. The girl Doa's age was running alongside Doa and Bassam. She had lost track of her family and wanted to stop, but Doa took her hand, telling her, "Stay with us, we'll help you." I'm going to leave it there. Oh my gosh, because that's so intense. So what we're going to do for this activity is a prediction. What is going to happen next? So I want you to predict what is going to immediately happen on the beach, and then how you think the story is going to finish from here, because we're kind of escalating to our big peak of our main event. So I'm really intrigued to see your predictions, and make sure you always support it with evidence from the book.